Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English language channel of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And today, as part of the guests that we bring you, some of the most dedicated public intellectuals, activists throughout the world. Today is someone who it's a particular honor for me to have because our guest Medea Benjamin has had a relationship with Pakistan that has been a very principled one that many of certainly my students will recall, and that was specifically on the drone program that was taking place and the drone attacks. And just to give an idea of the commitment of our guest Medea Benjamin, who's a co-founder of the organization Code Pink, her commitment to global justice and global solidarity. She came to Pakistan, went on the march to the tribal areas as much as they could go to show that these drone strikes must stop. And I remember also speaking to my students who were deeply inspired to basically the message that I remember is to never be silent against these types of cruelties and injustices around you, and to make your voice heard. And that's very apropos for Medea, because her voice is heard very loudly, not just by us, my viewership and others, but in the halls of Capitol Hill, in Congress, by the presidents. She is, and I say this, and I don't want to embarrass her, but a fearless activist in the United States, one of the most prominent ones that I can think of, that will not tolerate the crimes that the United States is often involved in its foreign policy, as well as, of course, speaking about domestic issues. So our theme today, the way we spoke about it in terms of the title, is the state of the empire and the state of the republic. Um, and for those of you that are wondering what do we mean by that, I mean, I really wanted Medea to kind of speak about some of the international flashpoints in which the U.S. is still heavily involved uh, in not so nice ways. And I think Medea will elaborate on that. And we can cover those aspects of what's going on in terms of foreign policy, as well as, I mean, is there any difference right now between, of course, the dramatic Trump years versus now the Biden administration? And the second part, maybe ask Medea to give some of her reflections on kind of the state of both political culture in the U.S. right now and state of social movements, which directions, political directions that things are going in the United States, and kind of what can be done. What are people like Medea and others that are doing there? So if that's okay with Medea, we can proceed in that way. And as I was saying to Medea before the show, it's very difficult not to start with what's going on, the horrible atrocities in Palestine right now, what the Israelis are doing um, in East Jerusalem, and now the bombardment of Gaza and the increasing death toll there. So I think if Medea, we can begin with the situation in Palestine right now, and maybe a couple of other major, particularly within the larger West Asian, Middle Eastern region, that many of our viewership have a deep interest in. What's going on in these areas, including the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which I know that, and I love hearing you speak about. But I think that the situation right now requires something to be said about what's going on in Palestine. So please, Medea, welcome to the show, and please, the virtual floor is yours. Uh, just the mute. Yeah.
Am I on mute? No.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Such a pleasure to be on with you. But it is a heartbreaking moment if you're watching what's going on in Israel, Palestine, particularly Gaza. I feel like we're watching in real times the Israeli war crimes being committed. And as an American whose taxpayer money goes to pay for these crimes, $3.8 billion every year, and as somebody of Jewish faith who I feel a double responsibility for what's happening. And the Biden administration is, Biden himself has not said anything
Mm.
about what's going on. His administration has condemned Hamas and
Yeah.
expressed concern and called for de-escalation, but hasn't condemned Israel. In fact, the Secretary of Defense just reiterated the U.S., quote, ironclad support for Israel to defend itself. And this is just disgusting to see the blowing up of 12-story, 14-story towers in Gaza, places that are residences, media centers, shops, knowing that a lot of civilians will be killed. And then to blame Hamas when we know, and I condemn all kinds of violence. I'm a peace activist, but you have to go to the root of the problem.
Right.
And when you see the dispossession going on in Sheikh Jarrah, the way that the Palestinians have been dispossessed since the creation of Israel, it's impossible to talk about the present situation without saying that, as has become clear to so many people now, that this is an apartheid system. The system itself must be addressed, and it is enabled by U.S. support. And that's what somebody like myself, who is a U.S. citizen, has to address and demand. That Biden speak out against Israeli crimes, that we stop enabling with our $3.8 billion a year, and that we reiterate the call coming from Gaza for a ceasefire.
No, I think this is the crucial point that many of us, don't highlight enough. That it is crucially the U.S. taxpayer money that is funding all of what Israel is able to do. I just wanted to point out that roughly around maybe a decade and a half ago, myself and some friends in the DC area, we started an organization called Sustain, Stop U.S. Tax Funded Aid to Israel Now. Of course, it's defunct now, but of course, the imperative of that still remains, particularly when it's, I mean, this is grossly in violation of even American law. But again, we turn a blind eye to it. But if we can actually connect what's going on in Palestine right now and the pure kind of the audacity and the ability of the Israelis to conduct what they're doing in the occupied territories and Arab East Jerusalem and so on, in the larger scheme of things of the Middle East, in terms of what the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, etc., what is going on that front, and then of course, relatedly, the Iran factor in all of this situation as well. So I know that's a lot, but I think it's very much related to the way in which now the Israelis are given a carte blanche. I mean, they've always been given a carte blanche, but it seems so flagrant at this point in which it's happening.
Well, it's also happening under the context that we just came out of the Trump administration in the U.S., where there were these, quote, peace accords that were signed between Israel and other Arab countries like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, also signed a deal with Morocco, and had these deals beforehand, Arab deals with Jordan and Egypt. And now you see the people in those countries rising up to support their brothers and sisters in Palestine,
Yeah.
and question what it is that their governments are doing. And I think when you put the U.S. in that context, you see the U.S. flooding the region with weapons.
Yes.
And you said, Janae, when in the opening, how I have confronted um, uh, everyone from presidents in the United States to Congress. Well, a couple of days ago, I managed to go into the shareholder meeting of General Dynamics and to talk about how they are making billions of dollars from flooding the region with weapons, from enabling the Saudis to carry out their catastrophic war in Yemen,
Yes.
in so many weapons that all sides in these conflicts are making these weapons companies wealthy. And there was a hearing today in Congress where they're talking about the budget from the Pentagon, and the ones who want to keep the budget constantly growing are talking about, you know, the threats that we still have from ISIS, from Al Qaeda, and these are groups that are basically created by the U.S. presence in the region, from the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. involvement throughout the region. And so it's you see, I'm not sure, you know, exactly which direction you wanted to go with your question, but I think as somebody coming from the United States, I see that the U.S. involvement in the Middle East since the time of the 9/11 attacks, now 20 years ago,
Right.
has been to inflame the region, to create tremendous sectarian violence, to flood the region with weapons that make U.S. companies ever more rich, and to then turn around and blame the Arabs and say, look, it's Hamas, look, it's Hezbollah, look, it's Iran. It's all these groups that are killing each other, when if you go down to the root of it, a lot of it is comes from the invasion and occupation by the United States.
Absolutely, and of course, one of the issues that you and many others, and even during the Trump administration, it finally got in Congress, because it's such a scandalous affair, this genocidal war that Saudi has been waging against Yemen, and this is particularly relevant also to Pakistan as well, because fortunately, maybe by a chance of luck, that the Pakistanis were on the right side of history in 2015 when the parliament voted that we will not participate. The Saudis put a lot of pressure on Pakistan and the UAE to participate in that war with them, but they did not, thankfully. But so now there was congressional movement on halting the sale of arms to Saudis in regard to this war in Yemen, but the President Trump vetoed that. Now in the Biden administration, of course, he has mentioned this several times. Do you see any movement on that front? Because I think that this is very important. As you know, the worst humanitarian crisis, cholera outbreaks. It's just been an utter slaughter for the past 5 years. It's unbelievable how this could go on.
Well, it was interesting how during Biden's campaign, he talked about the Saudi Arabia being a pariah state. He said he wanted to get the U.S. out of involvement in the war in Yemen. And he did initially put a hold on weapons to Saudi Arabia and to the Emirates while a review was being conducted. But since then, that hold has been lifted. He says they will only sell defensive weapons to the Saudis, but that is a very hard thing to define.
Right.
And we haven't got clear answers from the administration, even though our friends in Congress have asked them, what exactly is the U.S. still involved in when it comes to the war in Yemen. So Biden talks better about it. But when it comes to facts on the ground, it's not only the war itself, it's the Saudi blockade of the port of Hudaida that makes it so difficult to get goods, including fuel, into Yemen. The U.S. is allowing this to happen. In fact, the U.S. envoy appointed by Biden initially denied that there was even a blockade happening. So we are not happy with what Biden is doing when it comes to the Saudis, and think that much more should be policy changes should happen. For example, yes, he did make public the report by the U.S. intelligence agencies about the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But then what would naturally flow out of that is that he would sanction MBS and other leaders of Saudi Arabia for their rubber stamping of this brutal, brutal murder. And instead, Biden didn't do anything. So, yes, marginally better, but not good enough.
Right, and of course we will have to see how this goes, and as we will emphasize throughout, this is also what Biden does and the Biden administration, what they do will be heavily influenced by what we do or what Americans do on the ground in terms of putting popular pressure on the Biden administration, and particularly some of the more progressive congresswomen and congressmen, and what their perspective is on this. And yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say in there that I think that's so key what you just said, because I can talk and we can talk a lot about the things that we wish Biden were doing, but I think this administration is more able to be influenced than the Trump administration. We had nowhere to go under Trump. We didn't have any contacts within the government to put pressure on. We could do protests to our until we're blue in the face, and it would make a difference. Whereas now, I think we have seen the Biden administration change its positions on things like the number of refugees coming into the country and a number of other issues. And so, yes, this administration is able to be influenced if we are able to put enough pressure on them.
Medea, I sorry to go back, and since you highlighted it yourself, I will take the liberty of mentioning it, with hoping not to offend you in any way. But as a Jewish American, do you really see at this point, which I have certainly discerned on my trips to the U.S., that the old kind of monopoly of Zionist propaganda over American Jewry and Jews everywhere, that is falling apart, and that you have significant now a sizable number of particularly young Jews and others that are starting to become very critical of what Israel is doing. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. The scene in the United States has changed significantly when it comes to Israel-Palestine, particularly among young people, and not just Jews, young people in general. There are more organizations. There's Jewish Voice for Peace. There's If Not Now, which is young Jews. There's Palestinian organizations like the Palestinian Youth Movement that organized a terrific protest, a big one in Washington, D.C. yesterday, has another one coming up on Saturday, and having them all over the country. And there are members of Congress who are speaking out, which is not what we had before, and even coming to our demonstrations. We had Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian congresswoman, come. We had a Muslim congressman, Andre Carson, come to the demonstration yesterday. We have brand new people in Congress, like a Congresswoman Marie Newsom, who came in swinging against Israel. And we have a Congresswoman, Betty McCollum, who has a bill that has gotten much more support than it ever has in the past, to not support the Israeli abuse of Palestinian children by putting them in military detention, military trials. So there is a sea change. The last ones who are going to change are the people in Congress. I think we'll get an administration perhaps softening its position, but the Congress in general is extremely beholden to the right-wing Israeli lobbies like AIPAC. But in terms of the general public, it has changed dramatically.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, I mean, people focus on correctly so, on the Zionist lobbies like AIPAC and so on. But of course, now another unfortunate, very large force is Christian Zionism. And whether that's in the U.S. and Medea, I'll tell you, I was much surprised. I had gone to Malaysia, and there I was just told how large and powerful the presence of Christian Zionism was in Malaysia. So this is another
Wow.
factor now that people sometimes forget when they analyze the situation. And the reason I actually wanted to speak about this, the shifts that have taken place, not only in terms of our ability to speak on this question of Palestine, whereas before is virtually, I mean, we would have really very little space. We would be called names, booed out, and so on. But I really wanted to emphasize that so many young Jews are speaking out against this as well, because as you know, there are many forces that just want to portray this conflict as a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, and particularly for myself sitting here in Pakistan, and for a Pakistani viewership, a Muslim viewership. That is why I wanted to highlight that fact that there are so many Jews, activists, and intellectuals. I mean, I said we did a series of programs because this quote unquote normalization campaign that the Gulf states were continue to kind of herald, and they pushed Sudan and Morocco. Here in Pakistan, there was intense pressure to normalize relations. So I held a series of shows, and one show we had Ilan Pape and Phyllis Venice and so on, etc. as well. That we did a series of shows because there was real pressure being placed. And if you have any idea of the old Cold War framework and how at least the Pakistani establishment thinks it's so dependent on the Saudis, etc., and the UAE for oil and for loans and so that type of thing. So there was intense pressure, and so far we have withstood it, but we will continue to kind of raise this issue on here. So that I think I wanted to raise that because that's also been a factor clearly.
Yes, and another very important factor is the connection with the Black struggle, the Black Lives Movement,
Yes.
and the Indigenous movement. They are both extremely supportive of the Palestinians and
Hmm.
see a tremendous connection between the struggles that they are waging, like the Native Americans in this country,
Hmm.
and the ongoing discrimination faced by Palestinians and faced by the Black community in this country. And
Yes.
because the Black community is so getting so organized in the United States, and in every city there is a Black Lives Matter group, this is a great source of connection that
Yes.
makes people understand better why the issue of Palestine is so important to connect with. There's also a broad faith-based movement, and we talked about the evangelicals on the other side, but there
Right.
are a lot of faith-based groups that are
Yes.
supporting the Palestinians as well. So yes,
Absolutely.
there is change, and hopefully during this horrific time is a time for us to come out in large numbers, come together in large numbers, and put pressure on the administration and those in Congress who refuse to speak out.
Right. I mean, and that was a very important point that you emphasized, that there are many faith-based groups and particularly Christian groups, large denominations that have endorsed something like BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. I mean, openly supporting that. And so we must not forget that there in these the World Council of Churches, etc. All of these in these or the huge kind of church institutions and so on, they are also taking a position that is very different from from the Christian evangelical from the Bible Belt in the U.S. On this question. Although, of course, it's important we don't generalize either. But I wanted Medea to also ask you about relating this the question. I think you pointed it out really well that the global solidarity element of it, of as you said, the Black Lives Matter, and beginning from Ferguson, in fact, if you recall, where they, I mean, the
They
idea
told them
that
how to deal with tear gas, right?
exactly, and they and of course we know very well that the Israelis have been not only in the United States and other countries training police forces. I mean, training police forces, and then you think, okay, are they training them in basically in modes of occupation of cities? Which then you think about it, maybe, and so you have these obviously very tragic um, developments taking place. But then, of course, you have signs of hope and signs of resistance as well. But one thing, Medea, that, and I know that you have worked on this issue, you have written on this issue, written a book on this issue, and so I didn't want to leave it out, and that is the question of Iran and how that fits into this entire picture in the Middle East right now, particularly in relation to what happened under the Trump administration and the withdrawal from the JCPOA, the nuclear accord agreement, but also how these other governments in the Middle East and Israel, of course, are positioning themselves against Iran. Although now we see, perhaps because of, I think, I think because of the recklessness and the failures, really, of MBS to accomplish really anything of his foreign policy goals, whether to have a clear victory in Yemen, to destroy Hezbollah, or to do all the things he wanted to do. The clear failures to isolate Qatar completely. So I think that now he's almost being forced to kind of reach out in his small ways to these countries. But anyways, the larger issue of Iran, I know you have spent a lot of time thinking about this.
Well, I think the fact that when the Biden administration said it was going to go back into the Iran nuclear deal, some of us, myself included, thought that was going to be done like in the first week.
Right.
I'm going to rejoin the Paris Accords, rejoin the World Health Organization, rejoin the Iran
Yes,
nuclear
all
deal.
those
It
executive
would just
orders,
be
exactly, we were just waiting for that to be also one of them. Yeah.
right. And we waited and we waited and we waited. And the fact that the Biden administration didn't do it quickly was a huge mistake because as time went on, it's become harder and harder. And now they're in the fourth round of negotiations in Vienna. And it's very unclear whether there will be a deal before the Iranian elections, which are coming up in June. And there very well might not be because there are sticking points that should have been worked out a long time ago. So I think that is a big fault of the Biden administration because we need to have that deal in place so that the U.S. can improve its relations with Iran on a number of other issues and try to help ease all of the tensions, whether it's from Afghanistan and U.S. troops leaving there, or the war in Yemen that we talked about, or now what's going on in Israel-Palestine. The U.S. needs to be talking to Iran, and
Absolutely.
it's so. If a deal is struck, I think that will be a positive thing. It's the Israelis who have tried extremely hard to do everything to sabotage the U.S. going back into the deal, as have most of the Republicans and some of the hawkish Democrats in Congress as well. But it is interesting to see the Saudis and the Iranians talking to each other because I think the Saudis think that the deal is going to happen and that they are afraid that the U.S. is going to get closer to Iran. And they have had this cozy relationship with the U.S. And I think that's a smart move on the part of the Saudis and the Iranians because they need to talk to each other as well. So the region is so...
like I said, MBS has not been the great reformer. MBS has not been too successful on all of his foreign policy, reckless, murderous adventures that he's undertaken during his time. So,
disastrous on all fronts, but I hope that this deal does go through with Iran because it is absolutely critical. And if it doesn't, I can see the Israelis then bombing more Iran nuclear facilities.
Yeah.
And here we go. And then the U.S. feeling that it has to get involved on the side of Israel. And then we're in a huge war. So trying to keep the Middle East from unraveling right now between Palestine and Israel is tough enough. But if the U.S. doesn't go back into a deal with Iran, it can really blow up, literally, the entire region again. And I think it's important to recognize that Biden is trying to get the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. That is something that was actually negotiated under Trump. They were the U.S. troops.
In fact, because, and I don't want to, I've already exceeded your time. That was going to be my final question, and it's also very pertinent for us here in Pakistan, etc. It's a next door country to see this debate. I mean, this was even under Trump, but now Biden announcing that by September 11th, all troops will be gone. But the one thing I will say, Medea, that there is the skepticism, healthy skepticism that we always must have on these things, that troop withdrawal is good symbolically, but even more than symbolically. But we also know that there are about 1,000 special ops forces in Afghanistan. In addition to that, the thousands of mercenaries in Afghanistan as well. And the larger point is that the major, killing of civilians in Afghanistan has not happened by American soldiers. It's been through airstrikes and drone attacks and so on. So these are issues that we are very concerned about. So when we talk about and get excited about the American withdrawal, what about all this other stuff?
Well, the Americans are not going far. As you know, they have bases all around the region. They have warships right off in the coast nearby that they can use. They have drones that they can manipulate from right here in the United States. So it is a positive thing that the troops are leaving, and that they're also talking about the contractors leaving, because there's like 16,000 contractors.
Absolutely.
So that is a positive thing. But the U.S. has all kinds of ways to manipulate and try to impose its interests, and so they will continue to do that. But one thing that I do want to mention before we have to wrap up is that this has been a goal from the time of the Obama administration to pivot away from Afghanistan and the Middle East in order to turn U.S. attention to China. Right. And to some extent to Russia as well. And that is the justification for an even greater Pentagon budget that the Biden administration is proposing. And so for us in the United States, we want to make sure that getting out of what we are calling the endless wars is not just an excuse to start new ones in nuclear armed countries and in big power countries like China. And that's why we at Code Pink have a campaign called China is Not Our Enemy, to try to educate people to say we need to work with China as the rest of the world on issues like the climate crisis, on the pandemic, on health issues, and not to create new enemies that will suck up so much of our resources that we need at home, and to help people around the world, and not to put into more weapons of war.
Absolutely. So well said. Medea, what can I say? But it's just been such a privilege and honor to and to tell my viewership that right now we have been with someone who has been one of the leading, most prominent activists in the United States, speaking for so many people in the U.S. that are out there on the streets. But Medea somehow makes her way into the halls of Congress, shouting and screaming against these horrendous crimes that often are taking place in the world. So, Medea, we have nothing but incredible gratitude towards people like you in the United States for what you have been doing for all of these years. And so I just want to thank you for coming on the show this time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to coming back to Pakistan.
Yes, definitely. Inshallah. We would love to host you. Thank you, Medea, and take care.
Bye-bye.